So today I'm going to be doing an analysis of Epistemology of the Closet. Epistemology of the Closet was written by Eve Sedwick. So who is Eve Sedwick? Eve Sedwick was an academic scholar active during the late 20th century, early 21st century, primarily around the 90s. Eve Sedwick primarily focused on gender and queer studies, and through works like this, as well as earlier works, she is credited with helping to start the field of queer studies. She also analyzes popular literature such as Shakespeare for queer undertones. It is, however, worth noting that throughout her life, Eve Sedwick never identified with any queer identities, although she did not like the term straight, as she believed that sexuality was a continuum. And she died in 2009. So when analyzing this piece of literature, it is important to understand that it is very much a product of its time. Epistemology of the Closet was written in the 1990s and is therefore not privy to the expansions that the queer community has made in the last 30 years. For instance, when speaking about gender identity in this paper, she does understand that sex and gender are separate topics. However, her understanding of gender identity does not seem to go much farther beyond the male and female dynamic. She does make short mentions of trans individuals, but makes no mention of any other gender identities that go beyond the male-female binary, such as non-binary or agender. And it's also worth noting that she, when talking about sexuality, she tends to stick with lesbian and gay, bisexual, and straight, making little mention of more modern and expansive sexualities, such as asexuality or pansexuality, or many more. So the main point of Epistemology of the Closet is essentially that sexuality is undersimplified. Our understanding of sexuality is not fully developed. And that the idea that trying to fit human sexuality into small categories like gay or straight does more harm than it does good. And she argues this because sexuality, she believes, exists on a continuum rather than a stringent and strict, unyielding categories. Sexuality is more fluid and can vary from person to person. She argues that Western culture as a whole is too reliant on binaries such as poor and rich, good and bad, straight and gay, male and female, and that binaries like these leads to gaps in understanding about the human condition and about society as a whole. And to make her arguments, Sedwick relies on 7 axioms, and I could go over all 7, but then this presentation would be well over the time limit, so I will focus on 2 that I think the 2 axioms that I think best highlight and underline her main points. So Axiom I is the idea that people are different from each other. In this axiom, Sedwick argues that people are fundamentally unique from one another, but that it's human and particularly Western culture's tendency to put each other into strict categories, such as race, sexuality, gender, economic status, etc. She argues that even people who exist in all of the same categories can be wildly different from one another, and that therefore the act of putting people into categories is fundamentally flawed. And to bring this back to sexuality, she argues that even members of the same sexuality can vary widely in their relationship to sex. What they view as a sexual act, how much their sexuality matters to their identity, how much sex people want, what they find sexual, the sexual acts they like, and how much their sexuality matters to their gender identity are all factors that can vary widely from person to person. And essentially, because of this variety and the complexity of humanity's relationship to sex, the idea of trying to create small sectioned off categories is a fundamentally flawed action. And Axiom II is the idea that sex and gender are different. She argues that sexuality does not necessarily have to impact gender, that who people are attracted to doesn't impact how they feel about themselves. And furthermore, she argues that sex and gender do not refer to the same thing. She defines sex in two ways. First, as the biological arrangement of chromosomes, either XX or XY chromosomes, and that these affect physical characteristics, which she calls chromosomal sex, and also sex as the act of sexual intercourse. And she defines gender as a psychological identity, the way someone feels about themselves that isn't impacted by their biology and doesn't have an impact on their biology. And she argues that the male and female gender identities have been greatly impacted by our culture, that what society views as a man and as a woman and how they should behave has greatly impacted the way we see ourselves and the way that these male and female genders present themselves. And she also argues that even though gender and sexuality are different, they have become intertwined. That even though they are separate to each other, as, say, sexuality is to race, or gender is to economic status, they have become inseparable because of society's viewpoints of them. Essentially, that we now judge our sexuality based off our own gender identity and the gender identity of those we're attracted to. And she argues that the complexity of gender identity has therefore muddied sexuality, because if gender identity is so complex, how can one possibly create categories that accurately describe attraction to them? So in terms of my opinions, I agree with most of what has been said. I agree that people are fundamentally unique creatures, and that trying to put them into categories can be a messy thing. I agree that our culture relies very heavily on binaries, and the idea that these binaries create gaps in understanding and don't allow us to fully explore these different human faculties. I agree that trying to place people into binaries is difficult because of how unique and complex humans are, that based off that, it becomes nearly impossible to place anyone in anything. I agree that sex and gender are separate ideas, that someone's biological sex doesn't impact how they view themselves. And I do agree that sexuality is a spectrum, and that rather than fitting into set categories. Humans vary in terms of their sexuality. However, I disagree partly with her overall claim that labels are ultimately more bad than they are good. I think that labels generally act as ways for people to better understand themselves and find community, and I think that this overshadows the bad in terms of our understanding of gender and sexuality. I think that in the last 30 years since this article was published, I think the queer community has done a good job figuring out the different aspects and complexities of sexuality while still keeping the idea of labels around. So why it matters in terms of how we can use it for further readings, I think it's important to learn from this article is that we shouldn't try to fit people into clean boxes, and that this goes for the characters we read too. For instance, during the first week, I saw a lot of people wondering about Sappho's sexuality, whether or not she was a lesbian, and I think that it's important to understand that these people and these characters that we read about, that we shouldn't try to put them in boxes. Like, we shouldn't try to determine whether they are gay or whether they are straight. We should simply try better to understand them as people rather than as boxes to be checked. Say, for instance, Gaveston and Edward from Edward II. I don't think we should focus so much on whether or not they are gay, but rather just analyzing their relationship and how that affects the community. I don't think, in terms of when we are reading these things, that the categories and the sexualities we place them in is as important as what they actually say and how these characters actually act, and I think that that's what we should be analyzing. Thank you.